Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches, Jekyll and Hyde. In this video, we're going to be focusing on revising the character of Dr. Jekyll himself, focusing specifically on his moral compass and how that wavers and changes throughout the novella. So let's get started.
Okay, so let's have a look at the way that Jekyll is introduced to us by other characters, because in this novella we don't actually meet the man himself until chapter 3. So we've got 2 whole chapters to kind of make some assumptions. So the first thing that we hear about him in the conversation with Enfield and Utterson is that the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of the proprieties, celebrated too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. So one of the first things that we hear about him, even though we don't know yet that it is Jekyll, is that he is the absolute kind of height of goodness in the views of others. So everyone sees him as being really, really reputable. And you've got this lovely metaphor that he's the pink of proprieties. So there is no one more kind of proper than he is. And he does good, so he's charitable, he's philanthropic. So straight off, we're seeing some of the good qualities. But we also very, very soon have some doubt cast upon this by the link that he has to Mr. Hyde. And we hear about this first of all in chapter two, when Utterson is re-examining the will that says that in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, his possessions will pass to friend and benefactor Edward Hyde, but in the case of disappearance or unexplained absence for 3 months, Edward Hyde will step into said Henry Jekyll's shoes. So this is a really good narrative hook, because viewing it through Utterson's eyes as the initial reader is, there is massive mystery associated with someone who's going to give up all of their possessions and is planning for the sort of situation of disappearing. So immediately the reader is going to be a little bit shifty about what's going on there. We also get some slightly dodgy info from the character of Lanyon in chapter 2, who says, "It is more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind." So this is setting up issues to do with Jekyll's science. It is obviously incredible foreshadowing in terms of what happens in the relationship between Jekyll and Lanyon, and how Lanyon is the person that, of course, sees the depths of how wrong he has become when he witnesses Hyde transforming back into Jekyll. And then this super quotable phrase, "unscientific balderdash." So Lanyon setting up that Jekyll's scientific practices are unscientific, perhaps go against the kind of the norms, or perhaps even go against nature. And this has been going on for 10 years. And then finally, this is Utterson's view of him. Again, end of chapter 2, he was wild when he was young. So we're being introduced to the idea that Jekyll, despite his reputation, has not always been squeaky clean, because Utterson's logical way of understanding what's going on between him and Hyde is to assume that it is some cancer, some concealed disgrace, the ghost of some old sin. So 2 beautiful metaphors there describing the way that the naughty things that you get up to in the past can come back to haunt you. Okay, so as the novella progresses, we've got this kind of developing mystery surrounding Jekyll that's, of course, used as a narrative hook. And all of this is viewed through Utterson's eyes. So the reader is observing this mystery, or kind of questioning what's going on along with Utterson. So one here that we have there close up to the warmth sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. So this is after the death of Carrie. So the mystery is peaked here, because we're actually asking ourselves through this kind of like symbolism and all of these adjectives and adverbs, like, what has happened to him? Why is this affecting him so badly? What is that link to Mr. Hyde? Now, obviously, once you've read the whole novella and you know what's happening here, it's because of his incredible guilt as to what happened to Carrie whilst he was in the persona of Hyde. We also have the letter. So this is in the chapter, The Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon, where Utterson gets in contact with him to say what's going on, and he gets this strange letter back. But he says, "You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought on myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. So you've got this hugely impactful verb here. You must suffer me to go on my own dark way. And there's this nice sort of ambiguity here in the emotive language: dark way, punishment, danger, all very emotive. And then this incredible juxtaposition: if I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. So you get this great repetition in this complex sentence between I am the chief and I am the chief. So the kind of pinnacle. So it's almost quite grandiose even in his kind of negativity about himself. He can't just be a sufferer, he is the chief of sufferers. So massive hyperbole here as well. But this is a kind of the two parts of him. He's saying, yes, I sin, I've committed crime, but I'm also suffering as well. You could argue that there's a little bit of poor me going on here, because one could argue, knowing the full extent of the novella, well, you're bringing this on yourself. And then another little moment of mystery being created here is the incident at the window where Utterson and Enfield see him with taking the air with an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner. So the hyperbole and the simile here, they're all suggesting that Jekyll is in some way trapped. That's connotations of the prisoner, and then disconsolate means like completely without hope. So all of this presentation of Jekyll is about increasing mystery, building narrative hooks, and creating little red herrings for the reader as they go through the novella with Utterson. Now, obviously, at the very end of the novella, we get Dr. Jekyll's full statement of the case, or Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, where we start to understand some of his motivations, and we can really start questioning aspects of his moral compass, which I will get on to. But first, I want to look at the concept of motivations, tying it in with the concept of duality of man. So this is quite early on in the chapter. Indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. So he's talking about himself as a young man, and he's saying that, you know, he had this kind of like gaiety of disposition, this sort of like bouncy happiness that perhaps meant that he wanted to go out and have fun, but he also wanted to be seen as being very somber, very grave, very sensible, someone to be respected. So he's got these two parts of his personality, which means that he was already committed to a profound duplicity of life. Duplicity meaning two-sided. There's almost a kind of connotations of deceit there. If someone is duplicitous, it's a nice way of saying two-faced. So he's saying, well, there is this two parts of my personality. And then this concept of duality is repeated here in this little noun phrase: so profound, a double dealer. Again, two sides. But he points out that he was no hypocrite. I've just emboldened these ones because these are great quotable sentences for your flashcards. So the point he's making here is that he's not a hypocrite. He's saying the parts of his personality that are good, that are philanthropic and charitable, are real. He's not pretending. He does want to help man. He does want to do good things. But there's another part of him as well that wants to go out and drink booze and sleep with prostitutes and probably all sorts of other naughty things. He's saying he's like when he's in those different states, he is still perfectly himself. So again, adding to this concept of duality. And because of those parts of his personality, this is what led him to this kind of scientific discovery. But he recognises really early on that it was an absolutely disastrous discovery to make. He's been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck. What a cracking metaphor. Man is not truly one, but truly two. Now, I'm not going through all of this, but it's worth just mentioning, obviously, the fact that you've got such negative connotations in this metaphor, the dreadful shipwreck, and that he's doomed. There's, again, a sense of it being out of his control. It is in relation to the fact that, as a scientist, he's actually made mistakes. There's this kind of sense of fate here, being doomed, because it's not actually his good science that created this. It was an accident because he was never able to recreate the same effects from different potions, you know, with a different tincture. It was because something was wrong. So as much as this is about, oh, isn't this a dreadful kind of situation, isn't this dreadful what I've done, it's also a little hint to the fact that his science wasn't even that good, that it was out of his control, which is why he's doomed. Okay, let's talk about his moral compass, because I think this is the crux of any Jekyll question. If you get a question on Jekyll, you've got to talk about his sense of self and his morality. Let's look at his description of his feelings when he first transforms into Hyde. He says, "I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine." So we've got this brilliant metaphor. He's sold a slave to his original evil. And you've also got, I didn't write it down, but I've got this repetition, more wicked, tenfold more wicked, lovely comparative adjective there, which obviously connotes such evil. Which is then obviously highlighted here. So we've actually got more of like a semantic field of darkness and sin being created here in this metaphor. And the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. So the simile here demonstrates, one, he knows how bad he is with Hyde, but two, he loved it. And I know you can argue that he's Hyde in this moment, so he would, but it all comes from Jekyll's consciousness, doesn't it? It all comes from him. It's all in there. So the fact that he remembers this with such pleasure, and there's simile about it being delightful like wine. It's about excess. It's about consumption. It's about want, isn't it? And desire, not need. And then the way that he then starts considering who he should stick with, like once he's realized that it's out of his control, yeah, after his first accidental transformation, and then he has to weigh up what he's going to do. So he says, to cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had of late began to pamper. And to cast it in with Hyde was to die 1,000 interests and aspirations, to become a blow and forever despised and friendless. Now, this is interesting. So when he thinks, right, if I'm Jekyll, that's what that means. So we've got this anaphoric repetition, to cast in my lot and to cast it in with Hyde. So lovely anaphoric repetition demonstrating the two sides, like the two options that he has. But his issue with staying Jekyll, he's like, I won't get to have any fun. And look, late began to pamper. So he's telling us there that he has loved being Hyde, and he's kept on going, and he's kept on doing, and he's kept on thinking about it. So Jekyll, in Jekyll's consciousness, thinks back to Hyde's sin and goes, oh yeah. And the concern is, oh God, if I'm Jekyll, I'm always going to remember what I don't have. When he thinks about casting it in with Hyde, was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations, to become at a blow and forever despised and friendless, his concern is about reputation. It's not about the notion of sin. He's not saying to himself, I shouldn't be Hyde because I'll do all these awful bad things. He's going, oh, I shouldn't be Hyde because no one will like me. Everyone will think badly of me. So morally, a little bit problematic. And then here we have it. After he's decided that he is not going to be, he's going to stick with Jekyll. He is tortured with throes and longings, so lovely emotive there, motive verb, as of Hyde struggling against freedom, and at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. So I've popped this one in because it's really important that you recognise the moment where he consciously, knowingly becomes Hyde, even though he recognises, one, that he is losing control, and two, all of the things that he does are wicked and evil, but he chooses. And funnily enough, this is the moment that he goes and kills Carew, because there's this massive release of energy. Check out my video on Mr. Hyde for more notes on that. So I've popped this one in because it is really important that you recognise the kind of deliberation here. Any question on Jekyll, you need to think about the kind of blurring of the lines between him and Hyde. There are loads of examples, and I will look at some when I'm looking at Mr. Hyde as well. But I thought I'd look at this little bit here, which is one of the moments where he has lost control and is therefore shifting into Hyde. And it describes all the way here, you can obviously pause me and read this to yourself. It describes the frequency of these transformations. But there are a couple of things that I think are really, really important here. This bit, when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off. So this is to do with consciousness. So the moment that he's asleep and goes into his subconscious, which is where Hyde lives, out he pops. So that's one of the reasons, is because that dark nature of Jekyll, which is where Hyde comes from, is more in control whilst sleeping, because you are focused on your subconscious mind as opposed to your conscious mind. And then I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked. So the more he becomes Hyde, the easier it is. At the beginning, those transformations were painful, racking, and exhausting. But now it's easier, which suggests that at this stage, he is less Jekyll and more Hyde. So there's almost like a diminishing of Jekyll's personality. And this is emphasized here. The powers of Hyde seem to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll. And certain the hate that now divided them was equal on his side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of vital instinct. The reason that I've popped all of that in bold is I think it's really important. One, because it demonstrates that kind of shifting dynamic between Jekyll and Hyde, Jekyll getting less powerful and Hyde becoming more powerful. But look at the way that Jekyll and Hyde are being referred to in third person. Now, remember, this is from the full statement of the case. So the majority of this has been first person narrative of Jekyll. And now he's using third person to describe both Jekyll and Hyde, suggesting that he's sort of separated out, he's dissociated from both of those parts of his identity and then is sort of looking at them back and forth. Okay, last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is his final moment, because I think if we're talking about his kind of sense of morality and who he is, this is key. Because he takes his last moment, doesn't he? He swigs back the last of his potions so he can write the final statement of the case. So he can give it to Utterson, explain what's going on, protect him by not, giving any instructions of how to do it. But the last thoughts that he has, will Hyde die upon the scaffold? Or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows. So he is thinking in this moment, oh, I wonder if Hyde will go, like if Hyde will be executed. I wonder if he'll find the courage to release himself. Does he mean escape? Is he rooting for Hyde to free himself? There's a little part there that wonders if he's actually like rooting for Hyde. You could argue that release himself might be a euphemism for suicide, which suggests that he kind of is aware of what Hyde may end up doing, because of course he's committed suicide. But in some ways, the different interpretations don't matter because of what he says next. This is my true hour of death, i.e. he's never going to be Jekyll again. And what is to follow concerns another than myself. He's washed his hands of it. So there's like a kind of dismissal. Oh, well, it's not my issue. I wonder what will happen to Hyde. Maybe he'll escape. So, like, morally speaking, it's pretty problematic right at the end. And then his last kind of line, see like my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. Again, that third person, so disassociated. But it's a little bit like boo-hoo. It's a little poor me, isn't it? That unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. So bearing in mind, the first thing that we learn about him is that he is the very pink of proprieties. But also, the first time we meet him, we're told that he's got this slyish cast about his face, this sort of sneakiness. So we start off going, isn't he a great guy? And then the whole way through the novella, we start to understand that he's really not a great guy at all. In fact, morally, he is wildly problematic. And that's where I'm going to end it. Sorry, slightly longer video than I intended, but it's very difficult to talk about Jekyll without going off on one. If you've got any questions, do just give me a shout. drop me a note in the comments and I will get back to you. Otherwise, that's it from me. Subscribe if you haven't already. That would be really, really helpful, and you'll get notifications of when the rest of the revision materials are available. Otherwise, thank you again so much for sticking with me. Happy revising.